Hello, everybody, and welcome again to another Sailfast episode. So my guest today is John Loe, and he grew up properly salty. He's born in New Orleans. He was then shipped off with his family to live on a 50-foot sloop for nearly 2 years, sailing from Annapolis down to the Caribbean, which sounds absolutely marvelous. They had run-ins with the US Navy. They got boarded in the middle of the night and even blew up a transmission in Bequia, all before he was a teenager. John got hooked on racing. He made the Youth Worlds at just 14 and never really looked back. He's now a 7-time national and North American champion. He's still chasing that world title, though, and he's still happiest tinkering with his starboat, trying to find that last 10th of a knot. He's not short of an opinion or two, so today I expect we'll talk about SailGP, why the US struggles at Olympics, the impact of pro sailors on sailing, maybe GPS-based starting systems, if we have enough time for that, and also, perhaps most importantly, how to pick a regatta that you want to win. Right, John, where do you want to begin?
I guess on the last point of, how to work on your schedule and decide where to start and things like that. I think a lot of people struggle with making a strategy for their, time off work and their budget and that sort of things. The way I think about these things is if you just kind of sign up for every regatta and try to do everything, you end up spending a lot of time and money and maybe not accomplishing much. But if you really want to kind of measure yourself, I think it's better to have a plan. So the way I did it is I looked at recently, I had always been interested in sailing a starboat. A lot of people from New Orleans, where I grew up, John Dane, who's a friend of mine's father, sort of a mentor of mine in sailing, a very impressive guy. He went to the Olympics in the starboat in 2008. Andy Lovell, who was from New Orleans, had gotten second at the Olympic trials to Paul Cayard in 2004. So there's a lot of star sailing sort of around when I was a kid, and I always wanted to do it. Regrettable it's not still in the Olympics because I'd certainly be interested in trying that. But so I saw that there was this big, in the star class, there's world championships, which are gold star events. And then below that, there are continental championships or hemisphere championships that are silver star events. And then on down it goes to less prestigious events. So I saw there was a silver star event here on the Chesapeake Bay. I live in Annapolis, about 30 minutes north, in a place called Gibson Island. And so I said, okay, I want to target that event and sort of try to do really well there. And so I was able to, sort of make my schedule based on that. You need to have brand new sails. That's table stakes.
For sure.
When you're racing a sailboat, having new sails is like having new tires on a race car. You just have to have it. So you sort of work your budget back from there. How much budget do you have for sails? Then you need to do some practice events. So I sailed 4 or 5 events in Miami this winter with a couple of different crew members, both of whom were excellent, just trying to figure things out and learn the boat and everything. I didn't have brand new sails for those events, probably held me back a little bit. But that's just what the budget allowed. I sort of worked on the boat and tweaked the boat and got the boat exactly sort of where I wanted it to be.
I think it's a really interesting philosophy, right? Because you can just go through a season of, hey, there's like 10 major regattas for my one design or handicap racing, whatever it is. But I love that idea of picking one and thinking, this is the one that let's aim for. This is the one that we want to win. Why did you select the Annapolis Silver event as being the one that you wanted to win?
Yeah, so I did it because I knew that time of year I would have the time, off professionally in order to focus on it, and the time and the build up to it to be able to focus on it. If you're really busy with work or family, you're just not going to be able to put in the time to get where you need to be. So that was part of it. I knew my schedule from a family and professional standpoint was going to give me enough time to do something this spring. And then also I knew it was a place I felt comfortable racing. It's hard to fly halfway across the world and, rig up a boat for 2 or 3 days and think you're going to do really well. I mean, if you really want to do something like that, you need to have a lot more time. And I can't spend 3 weeks in Croatia or something like a lot of the guys in Star Class did this year. I just don't have the time. So that's kind of why I picked that event. My recommendation to people is don't just buy a new set of sails every year for your J105 and race the whole season and then do it again next year. I think it's better to have a bullseye on the map that you're working towards, and everything, whether it's your personnel or your bottom jobs or when you buy new sails or when you use the new sails, should be sort of working towards something. Now, sometimes you do that and there's 2 or 3 races that are 4 knots and giant wind shifts, and it's kind of a garbage event. And then you can't really measure yourself. You don't really know if this was a good test or not. But if you have a good event with a lot of races, you should be able to say, okay, here's where we really stack up.
Yeah, the sort of popular one design regattas tend to be in the spring. What used to be the news now, the Sailing World Helly Hansen Regatta. I felt that that was something to aim for in terms. I know so many people who wanted to have an impact there, but you didn't have a lot of lead into it, right? In the
Yeah.
East Coast US, you might have had sort of literally 3 or 4 weeks of practice to get there. So that's harder. Picking one
And
later in
that
the year makes more sense, right?
I've always thought that event is at the wrong time of year. Sailing in Annapolis is in the fall, in October, November, typically later. So a lot of years that event has very little wind for a day or two. You have this sort of warming sun with cold water. It's just a bad combination.
I want to go back to your perspective then on the events that you went to. You talked about going to Miami. Did you know what you wanted to specifically to improve at those events? Like, hey, I really want to work on starts or mark roundings, whatever it is, or was it generally just trying to close down weaknesses?
So a lot of this, the deal with the starboat is it's very the setting up the mast, which is endlessly adjustable while you're sailing upwind, is very
Yeah.
complex, and there's a lot to it, and knowing what to look for. And so a lot of the star class stuff for me was learning how to get the boat going fast, particularly upwind. Most sailing in monohulls is a race to the first mark. You listen to these old sort of famous sailors, and you got to be the fastest guy upwind. It's the only way to make it easier. Everyone at a certain level is pretty good tactically. Everyone will get lucky and get a big wind shift every once in a while. But if you're 1% faster, you're going to look a lot smarter. I sort of liken it to anyone watches Formula One. Lewis Hamilton won everything for whatever it was, 7 or 8 years. And then they changed cars, the design of the Formula One rule changed. And now all of a sudden he's like a very average driver. So did he get worse one night? No, he doesn't have the fastest car anymore, and he used to have the fastest car. And it's kind of the same in sailing, except you are more in charge of making the car go fast than you are when you're a Formula One driver. So I spent the time in Miami trying to get faster upwind. I spent a whole lot of time talking to the guy I was getting sales from, Eric Doyle from North Sales. He's a great guy. He's very smart. He's a very sort of what I would describe as like a linear thinker. I would ask him a question, how come you passed me on the second upwind? He'd say you didn't have enough upper backstay on and you didn't have enough outhaul on. Not some wishy-washy, I think this, maybe try that. He's very direct. Here's what you did right, here's what you did wrong. And I think that's great. I don't really have time for wishy-washy information. I want the answer. And he was extremely helpful to me getting up to speed, particularly on the starboat. It's just all the adjustments on the mast. I sailed with a guy, mostly Phil Trenter, who's great. He's a wonderful guy, very, very cool guy, very fun to hang out with. He went to the Olympics with Paul Kayard. He's won a couple of world championships in the class. So having Phil with me was obviously a huge shortcut. I did a previous event with Eric's crew when Phil couldn't do it. Pace and Enfleece, same thing. In the starboat, if you want to do well, you got to have an excellent partner. And so I was sort of lucky to get those guys for this series of events leading up to, and then during the Gibson Island event. So that was a big help. The One of the ways I think I sort of look at the sailing results is that it's sort of a three-legged stool. You have boat speed is one leg, tactics and strategy, trying to keep the boat pointed in the correct direction is another leg, and then boat handling is the third one. And if you had to pick one, it depends on where you are and your ability and your background in sailing. But I don't spend a lot of time working on boat handling, and I don't spend a lot of time really worried about the tactical side of it. Some of it is I think the boat handling is, as long as your boat handling is good enough, then your time is better spent on boat speed. As long as you're tactically, you can't just sort of think about tactics a lot and get better at it. It's Some people are better than others. Having a longer sailing background just helps you have a better batting average. But you're going to miss some shifts here and there. You're going to go the wrong way with the current every once in a while. Stuff like that is going to happen even to the very best guys. But the very best guys are faster. They have that, Lewis Hamilton's race car of 3 or 4 years ago. And so that is why they're able to have a higher batting average after more races. And so I try to spend the vast majority of my time, mostly on upwind boat speed with people that are faster than me or people that I think are, really good. That's where I think most people, people obsess over trying to have a slightly better spinnaker set in their J boat. It doesn't really matter. If you get to the mark a few boat lengths ahead and you cross that one pack of boats, then life is pretty easy.
That makes sense to me. I think that when it comes to boat handling and tactics, it's probably about eliminating huge errors or even fairly minor errors. If you can just get errors out of the way, then there's probably not a lot of difference between you and others if you are, tacking on the right shifts and
And it
getting up and down within a few seconds of somebody else, right? I get that, yeah.
and I think, people talk about sailing conservatively. It's like, well, that's really easy to do if you're fast. If you're slow, you're going to end up on the corners and on the ley lines and getting tacked on and overstood because you have no other options.
Yeah.
And so I remember I had someone who coached me a little bit when I was in college, and he would always say, you're sailing too aggressively or something. It's like, well, I have to. I'm slow. I can't sail around in the middle of the course because I get pinched off or rolled. And then you get faster, and all of a sudden you have the ability to sort of just stay with the group, not get a lot of leverage, and it makes life easier. But you can't have one without the other. Conservative sailing is a great goal, but the prerequisite is to be fast.
Yeah, I think that's right. One revelation for me was that on the times that we were able to get to the windward mark in, say, the top 10, or if we're lucky enough to get there in the top 5, which happened very, very occasionally, it's smooth sailing, literally. The wind isn't being disturbed by others. You've got fewer boats trying to get round that mark at that point. It is that great old expression, the rich get richer. That was a complete revelation to me.
Yeah, and the other thing that, is a big part of any kind of, whether it's one design racing or handicap racing is boat prep and having a good boat. They can't make these boats the same, even though they say they do. They're not. Some star boats are faster than others. Some have one with 2 or 3 different owners. That's probably a good one. Some are not. And you can sort of mess with it forever and drive yourself crazy, but that boat just might not be as good as some of the other ones. Nobody really knows why. There's so many things when you think about the keel, the rudder, where the mast step is. I mean, it's like you can spend an enormous amount of time and never figure it out. So when I got into the star class, I spent years before I did trying to find a really good used boat. And so I got Mark Mendelblatt's boat from the Olympics. It had won a lot of events, obviously with Mark. Mark's will be in the Sailing Hall of Fame. The guy's awesome. Um, so I knew the boat could do well. And so the only thing that would hold it back would be me. And that was sort of my idea. I think sometimes people forget and they read about it's a one design class that, the boats are all the same. Yeah, they're the same, but life is a lot easier if you buy a used boat that's already a winner. Because then
Yeah, I get that.
you have confidence in your ability to get the speed if it's there.
And you sort of take that out of the equation and of your sort of triangle of sort of key success factors. You take that one out of the equation because at least you've got a fast boat. The Stars are famously a very complicated boat to set up, and I've had Luke Lawrence on a couple of times talking about it too. Did that take you a long time to learn that? It sounds like you had help from sailmakers at North and so on.
You could set it up in the parking lot according to the tuning guides, and it's just following directions. It might take a couple hours. It's not really intellectually difficult. I think the thing that's hard is when you're sailing upwind and 15 knots and a puff comes and you're like, okay, well, there's 6 different ways I can remove power from this boat. Which one of these levers is the right one to pull? And I think that's where Eric ended up sort of being whether he wanted to be or not, my volunteer coach. And so I would come and talk to him after every day of racing, basically, and say, here's what I was doing, blah, blah, blah. And he'd say, you're doing it wrong. The order of operations to depower is this, then this, then this, then that. On some boats, a puff hits and you lower the traveler. Other boats, it's better to pull on the backstay. Other boats, they're all a little different. And you need to get the shortcuts and memorize them in your head to know what to do. Because a lot of if the boat's set up pretty well, it'll feel under control and it'll feel like it's the helm's about neutral and it wants to go upwind. But yeah, the guy you've had on your podcast, Scott Nixon, coached me some when I was in college in keel boats, and he would always say that having the boat, you can sit in a coach boat behind the race upwind and you'll know right away who's the fastest. They won't be the boat that's necessarily the most upright, although that's good if you can, but it'll be the one whose mast waves around the least. The guy who's the most sort of upright, but with a stable mast, that's your fastest boat upwind. And it's because they have the boat set up right where it's relatively easy to sail. And so a lot of that in the star class is we now have these gadgets on the boat that give you the heel angle. And you want to sail somewhere around 14, 15 degrees of heel. It feels like it's too flat. It feels like the boat likes more heel, but the best guys do that. And so it must be better.
For you, that's a key indicator, is it, when you're going upwind, is heel angle?
Yeah, I think that the heel angle It's something you don't really look at in dinghies. It's just, I don't know, it was a little bit of a blind spot for me. But when I left college, started sailing keelboats, got lucky and sailed a few events with Terry Hutchinson and a few with Chris Larson, very famous Hall of Fame sailors, and they were obsessed with the
Yeah,
heel angle.
that's
And
what I've heard. Yeah.
they were all about the heel angle, all about the heel angle. And some of it is there could be some magic in the design where the design of the boat likes this heel angle. I'm not a naval architect. Maybe some far yacht design guy could tell you the answer to that. But clearly, you sort of change all these different things on the boat, but they like a certain heel angle, and it just ends up working better. And so you can look at all this different stuff, but if you average the right heel angle, it'd probably be better off.
After a while, though, everybody knows that, right? Everybody's got their
Well,
boat on a 14-degree heel angle.
they certainly know it, but doesn't mean you can do it.
Or hold it, maintain it over time in different conditions, right? It's
Right.
that's the key that I found on the J105, that when there are moments when you had it at the right heel angle, it flies, it glides, but those were few and far between often. Because
Well,
things
and
happen, right? Somebody crosses you, the water gets disturbed, the wind gets disturbed. You then have to sort of settle back into that again. And for those of us down the fleet, it takes longer to settle back into that groove again. Obviously, I'm stating the obvious here.
yeah, and I think a lot of it is people get a little bit frustrated with it because they can't match the heel angle that they're supposed to, and so then they sort of look at other things because they're irritated and pissed off that they can't achieve this thing. And I'd be a great NFL player if I could run a 4.240 and catch the ball, but I can't. So, that's what, if I was trying to be in the NFL, that's what I would work on. I think there's also some of the obsession with heel angle is 5 years ago, people didn't talk about heel angle as much, but the people that were winning these world championships were mostly sailmakers. They were the best 25 years ago. Now you have, in a lot of cases, you have amateur owners that are skippering the boat that are not as experienced or even close to as experienced as the people that were doing this 25 years ago, skippering these boats. And so giving them something to cue off of that is a measurable metric is helpful. It's a lot easier to tell some Wall Street tycoon that, you're not at 15 degrees of heel angle and you should be, than I don't know, it doesn't feel quite right. That guy's not going to like that answer. And so I think a little bit of the obsession with heel angle is the way sailing has changed, and there's more of these amateur driver sort of classes than there used to be.
Yeah, I just to step in there for a moment. As you said, it's very visible, right? I had a instrument that would tell me, digital readout that would tell me my heel angle. I also had those inclinometers as well because I started to get a bit obsessed with it. And as a driver, it's the one thing you can see that's quite visible. You can't see the airflow over your sails. I mean, you can once things start to luff or things are going well, but it's not as visible, right? That to get to that absolute precision point, and probably the best sailors can absolutely feel whether their sails are pulling at the right, providing the right lift at a precise point. But as a driver like me, I couldn't. But at least I could focus on driving along this at the right heel angle. So, to your
Yeah,
point,
and
it's very
I think
visible.
I think you want to get to the point, and this takes some time, where you can sort of look at the head stay and the mast and know what the heel angle is without looking at the gadget. Because if you're looking at the gadget, it's always a lagging indicator by nature. So I would, in the starboat, I would get the boat set up where I thought it was right, and then I would look at the gadget to check my homework. I wasn't sailing around looking at the thing. You can never, if you do that, you're always going to be sort of way behind. It's more of a way to check where you are than to drive. I think it's, you need to have a sort of, Buddy Mel just talks about this in his books. And, where do you look? You look at the head stay with the horizon. You look at the angle of the deck to the horizon, depending on the boat. If you're on a big keel boat, it can be hard because there's a lot of sort of people in your way, especially on a J24. It's like really hard to see forward. J70, these small boats with a lot of people on them. But you got to have something that it allows you to look at and know sort of if you're in the right ballpark on heel angle.
Yeah, but he also, I mean, I know Buddy Malges is sort of famous for talking about that, but he, as well as visualizing that angle, he was also feeling the boat as well, feeling the boat setup as well, I think, just because of his experience. So those
Yeah,
of
and I
the
think
less experienced didn't really have that, right? So you're looking to technology instruments to try and shortcut it for you a little bit.
yeah, for sure. I think the other thing that happens is that there's a trend in all sailing where When the classes get more competitive, the sails get flatter and get trimmed harder. I sailed the J70 the first year it came out, and we would take the jib back to the sail loft and move the clew ring up a couple inches so we could put more windward sheet on. If you laid down those sails against the ones they're racing with now, they would look much flatter and the clew ring would be higher so that you could put more in haul on the jib. Something like the TP52, I don't know the exact degrees, but they used to sheet you used to see photos of them and they looked, like the jib sheeted hard. Now the jib sheeted almost to the mast. And so that is the trend in all sailing of competitive classes, is to make the sails flatter so that you can sheet harder. When I would sail, I did a couple regattas with Terry Hutchinson on the Barking Mad boats, and he would always ask the coach, "Are we sheeted the hardest? I want to be sheeted the hardest. You got to have the jib in the hardest." And he'd say, "Look, it's not that complicated. If you can go the target speed and your jib is sheeted closer to the mast, well, you're going to point a little higher. Life's going to be better. It's going to
Yeah.
be easier to live off the starting line."
And less drag.
Right. And so the concept of, get the boat up to full speed and then sheet harder and harder and harder and harder until the boat slows down and that's the edge where you need to be. That's kind of the way to think about it for upland sailing. Now it's easier on some boats that are more powered up. The Starboat, you can sheet really hard. One of these, TP52s, far 40, you can sheet really, really hard. But like J105, if you sheet hard, you're just going to stop. It's a very underpowered boat. It's harder to get going. So you kind of have to know, what the particular boat you're in is like. But in general, you want to be the guy that sheeted the hardest. And the photos or someone looking from behind, you can tell who sheeted the hardest pretty quick.
So sheeting the hardest and maintaining the right heel angle and a steady course so that your mast waving around is the sort of baseline for doing well in a star. Presumably that's what you were aiming for in a star.
Yeah, and I think that in all these classes, as you get better at it, the boat will have less feedback. You will sail with less helm, the boat will be flatter, the helm will be sort of more dead and neutral. You typically have to have a little bit of windward, a little bit of the rudder has to be above, or the tiller has to be above center line. And there's some reasons. I talked to some yacht designers years ago about it, about the flow on the rudder has to be from one side, not switching back and forth, but as little of that as you can get. Like your class, the J105 rudder is bigger than a FAR 40 rudder, which is a way bigger, more powerful boat. And so if you have any extra helm, you're just sort of dragging along this break. And so getting the boat where the sails are sheeted really hard, but there's no helm is, how you get that top speed potential.
Yeah, going up window, it's that compromise between reducing drag, so the rudder's not acting as a brake on the water, but it's also acting as because it's a large foil as well. It's giving you that sort of lift to complement the keel as well. So it's getting that precise point is a pretty deep discussion amongst a lot of keelboat fleets.
Yeah, and I think I always think of from my background in junior sailing, I think their boats sort of have two different design categories for me. There's boats that sail like a 420 or like a Melgis boat or like a 505, where the boat really likes to be flat and it likes the helm totally neutral, and it's basically trim the jib really hard and then ease the main out as you need and try to focus on going fast upwind, fast, speed, speed, speed. And then there's boats that sail more like an FJ, which is much more like sort of an old school keel boat, like a J24 or something like that, where the boat doesn't really go any faster if you try to foot. And so you're better off keeping the sails in pretty tight, maybe even easing the jib every once in a while and pinching and sort of sticking it into the wind. Because if you try to go low and fast, there's no gains to be had. And so I always sort of think these boats are in like two categories. Is this boat more like a Melgis boat or more like a J24 boat? Or for me, it was always a 420 or an FJ. And they sail very differently. Once you figure out which style of boat you're in, then you know which way to handle it. And when a puff comes in a Melgis boat, you ease the main sheet and pull the backstay on and keep the bow down. And you try that in a J24, you're going to flip over. Or a J70, you're going to flip over. It's much better to just pinch and kind of stick it a little bit. Luke Lawrence talks about that a lot. The J boats, you sort of get it set up right, and then when you have too much power, you push the tiller and stick it. The Melgis boats, you would never do something. I think the other thing just sort of reminds me that the sailmakers should be, if they're good and they like you, they should be extremely helpful to you. And you should be able to get a lot of information out of them about, they're sort of the only person there that's your coach that you're not sort of paying directly to coach you. And so that was a big help for me. I think that, in some classes like J105 in a regatta, you're not going to have a sailmaker racing on one of the other boats. But in a lot of the one design classes, there's a bunch of guys that are sailmakers that are out there racing. And if rather than just sort of saying hi and mailing them a check and getting your sales every few months, you should try to talk to that guy for 5 minutes, before the racing. Hey, it's going to be real puffy. There's a cold front coming through, big northwester breeze. What are you thinking about today? And he'll say, oh, I think in these boats, you really want to make sure you're focusing on the backstay because that keeps the boat on its feet, something like that. The sailmakers are they're sort of by nature very good sailors or the best, and then they also have an incentive to help you and to share information with you. And a lot of times I think people just sort of, they don't know the guy well, or they're intimidated by him or something like that. They tend to be very friendly. It's a sales job. You should lean on them for information. They're a free coach if they're good.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I don't think I knew how to use them because they would say, hey, now you bought this new jib or spinnaker. Yeah, I'll come on your boat for a Wednesday night race or a beer can race or something. I'll help you set it up. But when they did that, I didn't really know how to use them. I've talked about this before on the podcast that they'd come on, and because they're super friendly, they're extremely skilled, but they're also incredibly competitive as well. They want to win that race for you because that for them, they see you and think, okay, this guy is middle of the fleet. If I can get him in the top 3 or 4, he's going to be thrilled. And that's what they aim for. When really what I should have directed them on, you know what? I don't care about winning. I care about you telling us how to trim the jib in these conditions.
Yeah, John Dane told me this story about, I asked him when we were down in Miami on a wind delay, I said, what was the most helpful thing you did during your Olympic campaign? And he said, he'd always felt like he was pretty good starting, pretty good tactically, pretty good upwind. These guys gotten second or third at Olympic trials since the 1960s. I mean, he's an unbelievably good sailor. But he said these modern kids from lasers and fins were crushing him in the downwind sailing. And he just wasn't fast downwind in the starboat. And so he had Robert Scheidt, who's the best laser sailor ever, who's won a gold medal, has probably won 7 or 10 world championships. He was in the star class then and had won the worlds in the star class a few times. He had Robert come to Los Angeles where the Olympic trials were just to teach him how to sail downwind. And they would sail downwind for like 6 hours a day with Robert Scheidt next to him. And Robert would kind of show him a few things, and then they would look on the video on the coach boat, and then Robert would jump in with his crew and tell his crew what to do, and then they would switch boats again. And they did this for, I don't know, a couple of weeks. And he said that was completely transformed his downwind sailing, the way he thinks about it, the way he does it. And obviously, you know, John Dane's not going to listen to everyone's opinion about sailing. He shouldn't. He's better than them. But he was going to listen to Robert Scheidt. It took a guy like that to have him listen. And so I think it's hard to do that when you're an amateur sailor and you have limited time, and especially if you have a big boat where you got to have 6 or 7 people, they're not all going to show up for that.
Yeah, exactly.
But that ability to sort of focus on a specific task with someone you trust telling you what to do, you can make tremendous gains very quickly if you do that.
Yeah, I love that thought about if you had the time and money to make that sort of investment, I think it's right to do, right? If you play golf or you play tennis or whatever it is, and there's something you need to fix, you're not going to move through the rankings unless you make that change, right? I'd have to figure out, how the hell do I make this quantum leap? There's obviously something here that I need to do differently, but you can't go to YouTube and figure that out. You need to have that sort of investment of time and professionals on your boat who will be able to see pretty quickly, try this, do that, you're doing that wrong. Just because otherwise it's really, really hard.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a conundrum in sailing where if you want to get better, it's easier to sail. It's easier to have the time and the money to do it in smaller boats because you don't have as many people to deal with and the bills aren't as high.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the smaller boats are, because they're more sensitive to the ability of the skipper and the crew, are more difficult to get better than people. You can have a guy who's not very good who can write big checks and have a fresh bottom and fresh sails, and he can do really well in some 40-foot boat class, but the guy might not be any good. So it's a little bit of a conundrum, and it's always been around in sailing, is that how do you get better and where can you excel? I mean, I think part of the one thing people, sometimes don't realize is that you look at these great amateur or professional sailors and you think about how much time they've. Well, someone who does college sailing at a high level sailed 3 or 4 or 5 days a week with a coach for 7 months a year for 4 years. You're not going to catch up on Wednesday nights and one weekend a month racing to that guy. These guys have put in a lot of time. It's hard to catch them.
Is there any hope for those of us who have maybe taken up later in life? And I spoke to lots of people who've taken up later in life who've done very, very well.
Yeah, I think there definitely is. I think the way to do it is to, what I would probably try to do is to sail a dinghy like a laser or something. Laser's good because it's just one person or whatever they call it now, the Ilko, same thing. And sail a laser, in the local weeknight series, and no, you're not going to do very well, but use that to improve your skills for whatever your keelboat sailing is. And people don't like getting wet and sailing this little laser and getting beat up and flipping over and hitting their head with the boom. But you got to get over all that. And maybe if it's really windy or really miserable out or really cold, don't go that day. But you're going to learn a lot being by yourself in a dinghy where you can't blame anything on anyone else, and then transfer that to the keelboat because it's also logistically easier. It's hard to get 7 people out on your J105 or even 4 people on a J70. It's just a hassle. Somebody's dog is sick. Somebody's kid is, in a bad mood that day. I mean, it's always some problem with the babysitter or something like that. Someone's car broke down. It's very tedious dealing with these big crews. One of the reasons I think sailing has changed is as people's lifestyles have gotten busier and it's harder to get a big crew on a big boat. That's why there's the rise of these professionals some of these professionals are unbelievably good sailors that are, worth every penny. Others are available and that's what they sell. And that's worthwhile. Having someone who actually shows up every time has value. With the professionals keeping you in this box and keeping your sort of world small, there's this phenomenon that is sort of going on in all of society, but it's this sort of managerialist attitude that, first sort of came from the business world, from, probably Harvard Business School or something like that. But it's definitely a big deal in sailing where if you aren't really that good, but you hire the right staff, the right pros, and you throw a bunch of money at it and you win a big trophy, have you really accomplished anything? I mean, I don't know. Like the guy who wins the Kentucky Derby, who's not on the horse, who has a jockey ride his horse for him, like, I guess he's won something, but is it the same as, really learning how to do it and really having an immersive experience where you really learn what's going on and everything? I certainly don't think so. But you certainly see more and more of that in sailing these days where people come in that are very wealthy and they hire all the right people and they sort of just do this little tiny job well and, win a trophy at the end. That's one of the reasons I was attracted to the star class is you can't do that in the star class. You got to be good if you're the driver. It's not that expensive of a boat, but also it's enough of a handful of a boat where you're not going to do well if you're not an excellent skipper. The crew's head is 8 inches above the water when you're going upwind. He can't tell you what to do. A lot of these classes like that are hot one design classes today, you have these people that end up doing really, really well in the classes and they've put some time in, but the most important thing they contributed to the operation was financial. So, it's good for them. That's cool if that's what you're into, but I'm not sure it's as rewarding as really figuring out how to do it.
So I want to change gears here. I want to talk about the health of US racing, especially versus international competitors. I know you watch SailGP, where the US team has continued to struggle there despite having some of the great ingredients, right? They've got the deep resources, they've got pretty high profile support, they've got very accomplished sailors, but it's a struggle, whether it's a mix of sort of technical issues there or just tactical things, so the margins are so razor thin there, or whether it's a little bit more fundamental to that. And maybe I'm going to try and connect to this with the sort of the health of the sort of international US racing structure and culture in a larger sense, that it seems to be a little bit lacking in confidence. It seems to be a little bit lacking in terms of structure and culture. There's been lots of issues that are going on. The US campaigns, whether it's the Olympics or for SailGP, seem to be sort of less cohesive than others. They don't seem to have the platform depth that others have. They don't seem to have the resilience to, come from the back as many others do. That's my 30,000 foot view as an armchair watcher of it. What's your view?
It's a big topic. On the Olympic thing, sort of a narrower topic, I'm going to tackle that first. I think the biggest enemy to American Olympic sailing success is the strength of the American economy. If you're a great sailor in the US, you probably did college sailing, but maybe not. But in a lot of cases, you're already a college graduate and you have great potential financial rewards for you by entering the workplace. A friend of mine who was 4 or 5 years older than me, Cardwell Potts, was an unbelievably talented sailor, won the youth champs a bunch of times, had a top finish at the Youth Worlds. He was College Sailor of the Year at Harvard. He would have been a perfect person to do a 470 Olympic campaign. But, he graduated from Harvard. He had great professional opportunities in front of him. And the choice of doing an Olympic campaign was to go into debt and borrow money and ask every family and friend that he could find for money, and maybe at the end of 2 or 3 Olympics come away with a medal, or go work on Wall Street. And so the choice, if you're in Croatia, for example, where there's great sailors, if you're a sailor who goes to the Olympics, you're on billboards, you're selling cars,
Yeah.
you're doing television ads, you're a celebrity. But if you win
True
an
in
Olympic,
true in many other nations as well.
yeah, my buddy Johnny Lovell from New Orleans, who is a great friend of mine, he went to the Olympics 4 times, got a silver medal. He's not doing car commercials. He's back working at his accounting firm. These other countries have a lot of financial support behind their sailors because it's one of the fewer things that they can do. So I'm not saying American Olympic sailing can never get where it needs to be, but the biggest enemy to it is that, a kid who comes out of an Ivy League college who's a wonderful sailor can make this in the private market, or he can lose money trying to go to the Olympics. It's pretty big spread to try to come up with enough money to make this seem like a worthwhile path for that guy. On the SailGP front, Mike Buckley, who started that team, when I was 14 years old and went to my first youth champs, he was there, and he was one of the older kids who was one of the best. And he's always very nice to me. I've always liked Mike. I think he's proven to be an extremely capable marketer. His ability to commercialize the team and get these great sponsors is just
Yeah.
amazing. I don't know that anyone's been as successful at it since Dennis Conner in 1987, when he had Chevrolet and Budweiser and Raytheon and giant American companies sponsoring sailing. That's been really impressive. I think that they have some new people that are sailing on the boat, Michael Menninger and Andrew Campbell, that I know pretty well from junior sailing. They're very serious people. I think it's going to be hard for them to catch up to the best 2 or 3 teams. Sort of like we were talking about before with people that are relatively new to sailing. The people that are top 2 or 3 in SailGP are Olympic gold medalists that have been sailing those boats for 5 years on the SailGP circuit, and then for 2 or 3 years in the Bermuda America's Cup before that, because they're the same boats from that America's Cup.
Some of them seem to have the technical mastery and investment behind it. They seem to be able to adapt faster, perhaps because of the sort of the technical infrastructure behind them, like the New Zealand black foils, for example, where when they moved to those T foils, I mean, they
Yeah.
were just adapted to it a lot faster. And you just wonder because of whether that's because their program throughout the America's Cup as well is sort of is given them this team and capability of really being able to assimilate new technology and use it on the race course much faster than others.
There's also this question that, at least in my mind, that I don't see people sort of mentioning, is that it's a little bit of a weird league in the sense that, when you have a Formula One car or a NASCAR car, you're in charge of your own car, and it has to conform to this rule, and then they measure it in different ways. You pay a fee every year to be a part of the league, whatever it is, $8 or $10 million, to have a right to use their boat that they move around and rig up for you. I mean, what's to say all the boats aren't exactly the same? Maybe, you know, some people like somebody more or less and they gave them a slower boat. It's not clear to me that it's a little bit of a weird format because you're not in charge of your own boat. You can't take your own boat home and work on it. And you can't take your own boat home and practice with it. That's the thing. They're so far behind in just sheer lack of time on the water that it's hard to catch up to Olympic gold medalists who've been doing something for 7 years. I think they'll get there, and they're certainly going to be, more in the mid fleet. Although I do wonder from a commercial standpoint, when they're last, people talk about it a lot. If all of a sudden they're mid fleet, it might not be that interesting.
You get more clicks, right, with the story about
Yeah,
how bad they are. The
Yeah,
time on the water is really interesting. We had Canberra on an earlier show, and she talked about literally having 15 minutes of practice before being thrown into the first race.
yeah.
Which is, I mean, she's a great sailor. She's a great cat sailor, obviously, but that's really very difficult.
They've,
Well, he felt other teams were a lot more attuned into the team, the communication, the boats, and so on.
Yeah, it's also interesting. I saw this thing about Peter Burling's team, and he was talking about how great his grinders are, and they've been there with him from the beginning. And I do wonder if having a female grinder is just a big disadvantage for the American team. I know they're sort of pushing that angle. It seems like they're the only ones doing it, and maybe that's a disadvantage.
I must admit, I really enjoy it. I think it's great. It's quite exciting racing. It doesn't take an entire day. Each race is about 10 to 12 minutes, it seems. The way it's presented on television is very good, especially if you're not all that familiar with sailing. It's designed for people who have maybe a slight idea about it with ladder lines and that sort of thing. But sometimes when the ladder lines are switched off or they fail for some reason, then it becomes actually more interesting from a sailor's point of view, because then you have to start to interpret itself to see who's got that higher angle, who's going to cross, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's always we used to, we'd always practice in college sailing for the purpose of team racing. You sort of look at the other side of the course and say, are you ahead of that guy or behind that guy?
Yeah, for sure.
Some people really struggle with that. Some people sort of pick it up instantly. You're on the port tack ley line, that guy's on the starboard tack ley line. You're 2 miles apart. Who's going to be ahead? It's sort of a great thing to practice in sailing.
John, I knew this would be a fascinating and enjoyable conversation, and it was. I really appreciate you spending time on Sail Faster. Love your points of view. Thank you for spending time with us, and hopefully I'll see you on the water, and good luck with the star sailing.
Hey, thanks a lot, Pete. Talk soon.